Hello, and thanks for joining us on the second day of International Crisis Group's annual Watch List Policy Dialogue. I'm Elissa Jobson, Crisis Group's Director of Global Advocacy, and I just wanted to say a few words of welcome before our panel on Lebanon begins. The Policy Dialogue is part of the EU Watch List series, a set of publications and activities that Crisis Group tailors to the EU and its member states. The event, which took place yesterday and is ongoing today, provides an opportunity for exchange between policymakers, diplomats and practitioners that work on Europe's peace and security activities. Before giving you a short recap of yesterday's proceedings and introducing today's agenda, I'd like to acknowledge the support that Crisis Group receives from the EU through the EU instrument contributing to stability and peace, and to say that the Watch List Dialogue is part of Crisis Group's broader collaboration with the European Commission under the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and in partnership with the European External Action Service. This cooperation is essential for Crisis Group to continue its work preventing, mitigating and resolving conflict across the world. It also allows us to meaningfully engage with the EU and its member states, and helps us to identify realistic and actionable policies that the EU and other policymakers can take in their efforts to help maintain international peace and security. Now, I'd like to turn quickly to yesterday's discussions and highlight a couple of points that came out in the deliberations. Our first panel examined the situation in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. Panelists agreed that addressing the economic and liquidity crisis was of utmost importance, especially given the worsening humanitarian crisis in the country. They also acknowledged that engaging the Taliban remains extremely difficult and that any dealings with Kabul will require continuous calibration to ensure that support goes to the people of Afghanistan and not the regime. Our second panel focused on the intersecting crises in the Horn of Africa. Much of the discussion focused on Ethiopia, which is on the brink of an all-out civil war, and on Sudan, whose transition to full civilian rule has been halted by a military coup. Panelists discussed the role of regional and international actors in returning stability to this incredibly volatile region, and agreed that more concerted and vocal and persistent diplomatic pressure was needed by all international players. Today, we've got two more panels for you. The first is on Lebanon, where a humanitarian crisis is looming and an economic collapse is a real possibility, while the ruling elites seem unwilling to push for reform or relinquish their grip on power. Panelists will examine how EU institutions, member states and other international actors could mitigate tensions among parties, reduce the economic risks and promote good governance. The second panel today focuses on Venezuela, where socioeconomic problems and political tensions persist. Here, we're going to look at what measures the EU and other international players should take following the recent elections. Before I hand over to my colleague Joost Hilterman, our Middle East Programme Director, who is moderating the session on Lebanon, I just wanted to let you know that all of today's discussions are on the record, that they're being live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel, and that you'll also be able to watch the recordings of the panels on our YouTube channel too. Please do comment and interact via social media using the hashtag WatchlistTwenty21. Thanks again for joining us today for what I hope will be lively and stimulating discussions. So that's it from me, and over to you, Joost.
Thank you so much, Elissa, and thank you everyone for joining. I apologize for my background. I'm in a hotel room in Dubai, but I'm here. And I am indeed the program director for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group, and I have the honor to have with me three great panelists to discuss with us the crisis in Lebanon. We have with us Michael Miller, who is the head of the Middle East unit at DG NEAR, European Commission, and he has been in that position for the last 5 years. We have with us also Haneen Sayed, who is program leader for human development in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq at the World Bank. And we have Heiko Wimmen, who is the project director for Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon at the International Crisis Group, and who is based most of the time in Beirut. So yes, we're going to talk about, there are so many crises in the world, but it's particularly sad for me to see the crisis developing in Lebanon, a country that is close to my heart. And it's of course awful for the 7 million people who live there, including 1.5 million refugees. It's like a slow motion collapse, or maybe not even so slow. Heiko just published yesterday on our website a piece that we classify as an Our Journeys piece. It is based on field research, field being the area in which we work. And he called it's titled Lebanon, A Journey to the End of the State. It's the kind of title that sounds like a collaboration between Wim Wenders and U2, the band. But it's something far more serious, of course, because it is a narrative account, a very first-person account of what he has seen in Lebanon, broadly speaking, not just Beirut, in the last few months, as this country is slowly falling apart. So I'd like us to take a deep dive into this situation. We'll have some back and forth between the panelists for the next half hour, and then I would invite others in the audience to put questions in the chat, or you can even put them in much earlier. We'll deal with them in the last half hour, 45 minutes of the discussion. And I'd like to start with you, Heiko, because as I was reading this very vivid description, every crisis throws up its new vocabulary, and I was struck by the term that the Lebanese have started using, the lolar. Can you tell us, please, what is a lolar, and where does it come from, and really, how does that say anything about the crisis that Lebanon is facing today?
Yeah, it says a lot, actually. A lolar is a short form for a Lebanese dollar, and so before the crisis, the economy was heavily dollarized. I think about 75% of all bank deposits were actually in US dollar. And that reflected to some extent the experience that many Lebanese made from the Civil War back in the 70s to 90s, that the dollar is safe. So if you have your money in dollars, not in Lebanese lira, then you're safe. And so everybody put their dollars into the bank. My mother-in-law put her inheritance in a Lebanese bank. And then one day in November, we woke up and we could not withdraw dollars anymore from the dollars that we had in the bank, or we could, but limited. The limits went down and down and down. And after that, at some point, there were no dollars left that you could withdraw. So a dollar is a dollar that you have in your bank account. It's trapped in the Lebanese banking system. You cannot take it out. If you can take it out in liras at a very, very bad exchange rate, 4,000, some of it 4,000, the rest of it in 1,500 liras for a dollar, while the market rate now is 24,000, 25,000. So essentially, everybody who has dollars in the bank effectively has lost about 90% of their savings, really. And the only thing that you can do with these dollars nowadays is pay off debt. Because if you have debt or anything that you need to pay in dollars that is denominated in dollars, pre-crisis agreements, really mostly debt, like for whatever property you built or you bought, that you can pay off with these bank dollars. You can just shove them over to somebody else who can also do nothing with them, but your debt is extinguished, and you don't know, maybe in 10 years a dollar will be a dollar again, and then you actually have to pay it in real dollars. So better now, and so you have the funny situation that if you have a dollar in the bank, you cannot do anything with it, but then somebody else needs it for those purposes, these dollars, to extinguish debt, and you can sell those bank dollars to somebody else as a huge markdown. I think now if you give somebody a check of over $100,000 in a bank, that are in the bank, trapped in the bank, then he may give you $20,000 in cash for that. That's a lot.
Thank you, Heiko. And to the extent that there are silver linings in a crisis like this, and really there aren't, but this would be one, I suppose. But let's take a step back. You've given a very sort of personal account, referred to your family, your mother-in-law, and so this is a situation that people face on a daily basis. But I'd like to ask Haneen, who as a World Bank economist has a broad overview of the economic predicament there. Can you explain to us in a minute or two what is the country facing at the moment, economically and financially speaking, and socially?
Thank you very much, and I want to first express my appreciation for the International Crisis Group for inviting me to this very important series. Actually, I'm equally interested to hear about the Afghanistan discussion and Ethiopia and the like. So thank you very much for shedding the light on some very critical areas of the world. So Lebanon, what is it facing? I can tell you that today it is facing a fourth year of negative economic growth. So we started, in fact, before the October 2019 revolution. Already the year before, Lebanon's economy was in negative growth, at least 2% negative. And then it increased to about 7% negative growth in 2019. And 2020, last year, was very dramatic with more than 21% negative growth. And this year, we are projecting another 10% negative. So you can imagine what this means. Essentially, Lebanon came into the crisis with a GDP of about $55 billion. Today, it is about $20 billion. Real per capita GDP has fallen by close to 40%. And this is the kind of economic contraction that we normally witness in times of a war or protracted conflict. So this is all happening within 3 years, very dramatic. And therefore, in the spring of 2021, the World Bank we issued what's called our Lebanon Economic Monitor. It's a twice or 3 times a year document looking at deep look into the Lebanese economy. And what we looked at in that piece of work is for the past 150 years, we analyzed the economic and financial crises that have taken place. So the important point is that there's many financial crises that happen around the world. This is not unique. Lebanon is not unique in that sense. But what is unique is the depth, the severity, and the short period within which this contraction has been happening. And comparing Lebanon's current economic financial situation with episodes that had taken place globally in the past 150 years, we have ranked Lebanon among the top 10, possibly the top 3 most severe crisis episodes. The worst one being the Civil War, Spanish Civil War, and then in Argentina. But basically, Lebanon is really up there in terms of, unfortunately, the depth of its economic crisis. Now, what is this translating literally into people's lives? Poverty has increased dramatically. Now, there are no updated poverty figures, and this is one of the legacy issues in Lebanon. It is a very data-poor country. Doesn't produce very good statistics and data, but using projections and estimates and coalescing among different agencies, ESQA, ourselves, and so on, poverty is at least increased by 40% in the last 2 years, 2.5 years. Again, the important point is that it's very fast and sharp in a very short period of time. So today, possibly close to 30% of the population could be under the extreme poverty line, which is the food poverty line, i.e. anyone below that cannot afford the basic food. And then maybe close to 70% are under the overall poverty line, cannot afford food and housing and health and so on. If we just look at inflation, how fast that has risen, I'll give you a number. Since 2019, inflation has gone up by 450% in Lebanon. This as measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So, and I can go on and on with kind of figures, of course, already about the currency I mentioned. People cannot access their money. So, middle class has almost been wiped out, and public services are almost coming to a halt. Right, schools were opening now, but it's stop and go. Many schools have not been able to open. There's been a very severe fuel crisis, especially over the summer, where shortages were witnessed everywhere. Now, while there hasn't been, shortages have stopped, but that's because the subsidy for fuel, foreign exchange subsidy by the central bank, has been almost eliminated. But that's meant that the prices have shot up. And unfortunately, to help people weather this kind of situation, the social safety net in Lebanon is very weak and small. So this is just a quick picture of how things are, and happy to delve into this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. That is really truly alarming. And I'm somebody who is following the crisis in Lebanon, and I'm shocked by the figures you give me. And so let me turn to Michael and ask you, Michael. There are a number of international actors who are poised to help the Lebanese weather this crisis to the extent possible. The European Union, of course, is a major one. What can you say about what the Europeans are doing to address this crisis with the means available to you?
Thank you very much, Joost, and thanks to ICG as well for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's a great pleasure to be with you again, despite the fact that we can't do it in person. That's a pity, but okay, that's with the situation we find ourselves in. Now, what I wanted to say was how much for the European Union, Lebanon is a valued partner in the Middle East. So the country's stability, the country's prosperity is important for the region, and it's also important for Europe. And we do recognize, as you already mentioned, Joost, the fact that Lebanon is hosting, and has been hosting now for almost 11 years, a very significant number of refugees from the conflict in Syria. So what I would want to say is that, yes, we are doing a lot, and I'll unpack that in a moment. I think that without external support, we need that. We need to continue to invest in solidarity with the Lebanese people, but it's more than that. So I think without political will on the Lebanese side and an intention to act on structural reforms that are very long overdue, then whatever we do will not be enough. So external support is not enough. And it's a recognition of reality that I want to put on the table. And it's also a recognition that, in fact, more than anything, what we need is the confidence for a return of private sector investment and of Lebanese finances to the banking system for productive investment. And without that confidence, it's very difficult to see us or Lebanon digging itself out of the economic crisis in which it finds itself. And Haneen has very amply illustrated just how deep is the economic crisis. I would want to add that this is not just an economic crisis, it's a political economic crisis. So the political institutions in Lebanon are in gridlock, they are not functioning. And on top of that, you have a broken social contract. So there's a lot to be done here. It's a very complex situation indeed on the ground. And it seems to the European Union that the Lebanese people are paying an extremely high price for inaction on the part of the Lebanese political elite. So you asked about what the EU is doing. I just wanted to recap some fundamentals, So since the start of the crisis in Syria, we have made available in Lebanon grant financing of the order of 2 billion euros. So it's a phenomenal amount of funding that we have made available for Lebanon's own development, but also to help it weather the impact of the Syrian crisis, then the impact of COVID-19, then the impact of the Beirut port explosion. So there's an awful lot going on here, and the grant financing is of a very significant magnitude. Last year in 2020, what this translated into was new grant financing worth 321 million euros. And in 2021, what you will see is that the European Union will make available 291 million euros in grant financing. So we will also shortly announce new our intention to make available a very large envelope of financing in the period 2021 to 2024 for the continued Syria crisis response, which obviously has a very big impact on Lebanon. Now, what I wanted to say here is that the funding demonstrates the European Union's very strong solidarity with the Lebanese people. But I would be missing part of the message from Brussels if I didn't stress that we are also rather frustrated with the political class. So this is why we have Foreign Affairs Council conclusions that we adopted in December of last year, which basically state that there is conditionality that applies to our support for Lebanon. It's a little bit tough love, if I'm honest with you. So tough love in the sense that we see that there are things that need to happen before all the levers that we have at our disposal will be effective in helping the Lebanese. So we don't just want to put money in to keep heads above water for a further 2, 3, 5, 10 years. We want to see the country get back on its feet. We want to see the emergence of accountable state institutions, and state institutions that are not only accountable, but also feel themselves and act as if they are accountable to the Lebanese citizens. And on that basis, then the money that we can put into Lebanon, that can be far more effective. So what I wanted to illustrate here was that unless we see serious reforms put in place by the government of Lebanon, then we will not be able to use budget support or macro-financial assistance or guarantees for public and private sector investments in the country, or our blending tools, which allow Lebanon to borrow at extremely low subsidized rates of interest. And this is going to be obviously a huge problem. What it adds up to is, as I mentioned, we need to move on from the current situation, put a little bit of structure into it. Joost, I don't know if you want me to go on now about our priorities in terms of reforms, or if you want to take the microphone back. We'll come back to that later.
Thank you, Michael, for even asking that. I will come back to you, and you will have another bite at the cookie, so to speak. But I want to go around the room one more time, at least. In the meantime, I would encourage listeners, I suppose listeners is the right word now, to put questions in the chat function, and we will come to these in a little while. But Heiko, so we've heard the economic analysis. We've heard what the European Union can do in terms of financial assistance, but we've heard the word reform mentioned and the need for it, of course, in order to really unleash or make available the kind of support that might make a real difference in putting Lebanon back on its feet. How possible is real substantive reform in Lebanon at the moment? What would it require, in your view? Because clearly, we not only have this economic and financial crisis, we also have political stagnation.
Well, I mean, it's a very, very heavy lift, right? So that's just to say that at first. So I would say, I mean, there are a few emergency measures that are necessary, and then there are others that are more long term, and both are equally difficult. The most urgent part, I think, is to reactivate or revive the financial system. I mean, you can't have an economy without banks, right? You can't have an economy with the financial sector. So that, if there's no credit, you can't transfer money abroad into the country, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the very first steps, and for that they have some very tough political decisions have to be taken, and those affect the interests of people with interest in the banking sector, the financial sector, and the financial and the political sector are very closely intertwined. So in a way, you're asking or you're expecting from a couple of actors to act against their own vested interest. So that is a very huge lift, and attached to it, you have the trouble with the audit of the central bank. I mean, the central bank will be central, and that's not only a pun, it's just a fact, in any attempt to fix the situation. I mean, the money that comes from the IMF, if it comes, it has to go somewhere, right? And as long as we don't even know how much money there is left in the central bank, it's really very hard ask for anybody to put more money inside, right? So I mean, and these are really emergency measures and that have to be taken. And I mean, it's incredible and it's really criminal, I would say, that they have been delayed now for almost 2 years. And the solutions are not rocket science. They're pretty clear. There have been plans that maybe you can tweak around them, but they've been like left to rot for a year or more. So those are two extremely important parts. You need to come to a budget that is sustainable, you know, and that's also linked to the financial sector, but it's also linked to the huge state sector, the huge public sector, 300,000 maybe more public employees, who are now earning $50 a month or 60 or 70. As a result, they only show up once a week on Wednesdays. And that also already tells you how much you can expect in terms of reform. And in the end, somebody has to implement these reforms. If public sector employees don't show up for work and have no reason to show up for work, then how are you going to do anything? So you have to raise their salaries to a point that makes sense, but you have to also get rid of a good part of it. And that is, again, a huge political lift that has to be done. And we have elections supposedly in March. We have a big electoral year coming up. Anybody who touches this file will burn his fingers, or maybe he won't have a hand left after that. You know? So, I mean, so those are very immediate problems that have to be tackled, you know. And then you have the more long-term issues. You have the whole system, the whole question of public procurement, right? I mean, there's a new public procurement law. Has been fought over for a long time, but as always here, it's the questions about implementation, you know. So this whole practice of the public procurement, any time of public works, public resources are in the end sources for the political elite to reconstitute their power through clientelism by handing out state funds or state works or whatever as favors in return for political loyalty and support. This system can no longer be sustained, and that is a long-term challenge. Again, you expect the people who make decisions to act against their own interest, you know. And just one example, I think, makes it clear how big the challenge is. Right now we have 1 hour of electricity per day, 1 hour of state electricity per day. I just ask in number how much they have these days. And so, can you still hear me? Because you froze, Ghost. Hello? Hello?
We can still hear you, Michael.
Yeah? Yeah, no, okay. I mean, sorry.
You were slow for a moment, but you're there.
Okay, collection slum, yeah. So we have 1 hour electricity, public state grid electricity per day in the capital, right? And everybody's using these generators, it's polluting, it's expensive. So there are plans and schemes how to address this. There are plans to bring in gas from Egypt, electricity from Jordan, all good solutions to get energy at a better price and be done more sustainable. But for this to work, you have to start actually applying a tariff that reflects production cost, or whatever you have to pay to the Jordanians and the Egyptians for this gas and electricity. You have to be able to collect these tariffs, you know, and you have to look at the electricity company, which has been like a grave for billions of dollars over the past over the past 20 years, you know. And so even to do these like really urgent, immediate improvements, you run into a legacy of structural, I'm not sure what the right word is, of structural disaster, ingrained structural disaster, that to entangle is extremely difficult in a situation where you have a political leadership that is delegitimized, that does not have the legitimacy to expect or to demand more sacrifice from the population, that is facing elections and so on and so forth.
Very good, Heiko. I may push you later on a little bit more on the question of what should happen beyond the measures you've outlined, which all make very good sense, but it doesn't look like they're very likely to happen. So and then comes the bigger question: what does Lebanon need? But Haneen, let me come back to you, because you've said something about obviously the World Bank is studying the situation very closely. It's gathered whatever data it could gather from the poor information that is available. You have your analysis, and then you have your activities. Lebanon is waiting for major funding also from the IMF, but the IMF again is calling for reform before it releases any funds sensibly. So how well placed are external actors to support Lebanon in this crisis without, in fact, reinforcing the same patterns that have led us, or that have led Lebanon into this deep hole? In other words, supporting the political elite that has been so self-serving and greedy. And you mentioned that Lebanon is high at the top of this most severe crisis, and you went back far into history, actually. How did these other, or can you say what are the means available to pull a country like Lebanon out of such a severe crisis? What kind of historical precedents can we rely upon for just to see what could be done in this case?
Thank you, just for this question. Complex, and but I think, as I mentioned, Lebanon is not unique in terms of facing economic financial crises. However, it is one, as I mentioned, very severe in the sense that it's almost like a perfect storm. Multiple crises that came on top of each other, including some external ones like COVID, but then you had the port of Beirut blast. This is all on top of already the banking sector, the debt situation, the fiscal, and so on. And then, yes, as somebody's already pointed out, the political deadlock that continues is almost really a feature of Lebanese, the makeup of the Lebanese, to constantly have that Lebanese policymaking have this political deadlock. So in that sense, coming out of it is difficult, is complex, but it is not impossible. I believe most of what, the issues, there's probably for most of them, there is agreement as to how Lebanon can move forward on. Agreement, I mean technically, of course, not politically, but technically, and this is also important. So electricity sector, this has been on the table to be reformed for many years. We know what needs to be done, whether it be on the regulation and the governance, whether it be on the financing and the costing and the tariff. But it requires absolutely a political will, a coherence and the like. You take education sector, health sector, and so on. And these are complex, and one has to say why it hasn't been achieved until now. However, the point I want to make is that it is not impossible. There are already little bits and pieces of reforms that are being pushed and supported, and that likely will happen. I'd like to mention one, which is, I mentioned earlier, lack of social safety net that is adequate and be able to service the population at large. What's happening now is that there is strong and agreed political movement around setting up a new database, establishing a new social database that would then be used and transparently with very close supervision from the World Bank and other entities. That we use essentially to assist people to disperse cash transfers. This is heavy lifting and it's taken a long time, but that to me, actually, this database is creative and it uses the sort of follows the international practices or standards of identifying beneficiaries and the like. That happens, and I think the next few months will literally demonstrate that. That's already a reform in a vital sector of social protection, which we, as well as the European Union, are heavily involved in. Electricity sector is the second one that we have been involved for many years, have not had much success, but it's back on the table now again, and maybe out of desperation. Lebanon has no choice at this point. Heiko mentioned the 1 or 2 hours a day of official electricity from the state. And so when it reached to that bad situation, I think all the parties have realized something has to happen, and therefore, as you know, the gas pipeline and from Egypt and electricity from Jordan effort is underway, and it is promising. Without saying too much more about it, but that is potentially will have very important, will be a huge achievement. So I think there are ways for Lebanon. We must, I mean, as an international community, we must continue to advocate for, as Michael mentioned, reform. I think it's absolutely fundamental. And these reforms, can be done now, and then look for ways where we can help the population, help people directly so that they don't suffer through this. I believe essentially that this is something Lebanon can come out of. It is needs continuous engagement from the international community. I think there's just, and the Lebanese know that, they actually appreciate that. And in fact, look to us many times to help adjudicate between or mediate between the different political parties. And I guess we've gotten used to playing that role. If that helps Lebanon achieve the reforms and move forward, I think that's very important. One last statement I want to say simply is that, yes, they're going to have to come to some deal with the IMF, because that, as difficult as it may be, is what's going to unlock significant funding from World Bank, European Union, from others, from the Gulf states. You need the Gulf states ultimately to get out of this. So, and the Lebanese, I believe, know this. Next year is going to be a complex year because of different political events, the elections, and for parliament as well as for the president. But one has to still remain hopeful that this will bring change to Lebanon. It may be slow, but I think that's it's the only way forward. And there's more and more consensus, I believe, among different, in civil society, which has become extremely active and engaged in economic and financial issues, which was never the case before. At least now you hear so many that are asking questions, that are getting involved, excellent TV talk shows on the economic situation. So there's more awareness of where Lebanon was, what were the mistakes, and where it needs to go. So we hope that this, with the support of the international community and the dynamic that has started to change in the country, be able to help Lebanon get out of where it is. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. It's certainly good to hear that however dire the situation may be, there could be a way forward, and that the commitment of the international community is strong to help Lebanon out of this trough. There have been a couple of questions already come in from the audience. I'll turn to them shortly, but I want to continue this conversation a little bit further. Michael had mentioned this crisis, and what if the situation doesn't change in the next year or two, and we see an imploding state, which clearly is not a European interest after what has happened in Syria.
I'm afraid I cannot hear you.
You couldn't hear my question? Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you now, but I missed your question.
Okay, let me put it again. Sorry about that. The connection is not always strong here. So I said we have a couple of questions from the audience. We'll come back to that in a minute. But Michael, I wanted to follow up on what you had said earlier, that you wanted to mention the sort of the top priorities for the European Union in Lebanon. And I wanted to add to that, if you could say something about what leverage Europe has to help Lebanon out of this crisis, given that the elite is so entrenched and is, of course, it's in its self-interest not to take all the steps that it should be taking in order to get Lebanon out of this crisis. So what if the situation doesn't change? The big what if question, what could Lebanon, what could the European Union rather do in that case? What's left?
Thank you, Joost, and I got you the second time round. So let me start by saying that I think Heiko and Hanin have hit the nail on the head when they talk about the fact that certain reforms have gone forward, but implementation is really the challenge, and there are certain reforms that remain stuck. So what I wanted to start with was a point that for us is particularly important, which is that we see that there is limited administrative capacity on the side of the government of Lebanon, that we recognize. That's not entirely new, but it is very acute now because of the devaluation of the Lebanese pound and the fact that civil servants' salaries are paid in local currency. So that's a problem, and this is why for the past 18 months we have identified a small number of extremely important reforms that we see are of a structural nature and which the government of Lebanon has to prioritize. And in a way, what I should start with is, of course, how much we are happy to see that there is a government of Lebanon, and how happy we are that the ministerial declaration of that government includes a lot of things that we want to see happening. So there is a political commitment that is there. But what I wanted to focus on was really this smaller number of reforms that we see as being particularly important. So the priorities. And that's a little bit missing from the ministerial statement. You need to have priorities because the admin capacity is rather low. So for us in the European Union, the priority number one is to reach an agreement with the IMF. Hanin has mentioned this. This is important. The prior actions that we anticipate the IMF will insist upon will, in fact, encourage reform-minded politicians in the government of Lebanon to take forward the action that is needed on deciding on the repartition of the debt burden and on basically the reset of the financial sector, which really does now need to happen if you want investments to flow from outside of the country. That's number one. Then we see structural reform. So again, a small number of structural reforms for which, in the view of the European Union, we expect the government of Lebanon to focus upon. So here we have judicial independence, we have work on anti-corruption, we have the public procurement law and its implementation now, as Heiko has mentioned, now that it is adopted, and finally we have electricity sector reform. And if you allow on this last issue, I think Heiko's use of this sector as the illustration of the depth of the crisis is a very appropriate one, given just how much of the revenue under the control of the government of Lebanon goes to work to keep this sector in a pretty poor state, in fact. So even with the subsidies and the efforts and the political effort that we've seen, we see enormous problems. So we still want specifically to see the establishment of an independent regulator for the sector. For us, this is of primordial importance. Then, as already mentioned, what we want to see is that there is a proper tariffication policy in place. This has to, in fact, cover the cost of production, the cost of investment in new infrastructure, and operational expenditure and maintenance. So you need to move from the situation which is now, it's just not sufficiently ordered, to one in which there is a properly planned budget. And even if that may not happen overnight, there is sector planning in place which is convincing and which serves to increase our confidence in the capacity of the government of Lebanon to do this work and take the reforms forward and deliver, because that's really what we want to see happening. So there is an awful lot of solidarity and support for the Lebanese people and the government, but we need delivery against these reform expectations. And by the way, reform expectations to which the government itself has signed up. So in a way, we should be pushing at an open door, but sometimes the door remains closed, I regret to say. Now, what leverage does the EU have? I think we have plenty. I mean, I believe, if we boil it down, we have this issue of confidence. So the EU can send signals of a political nature to endorse what the government of Lebanon is doing, to encourage the right approach to taking forward reforms. That is in our power. We are just about to start discussing with the Lebanese what should be our priorities for the EU-Lebanon partnership for the coming years. That's a negotiation that has not yet been launched, but where we are progressing well. Then we are, on the basis of that discussion, we will be able to discuss with the Lebanese what is our longer term planning for our support, the money, where it should go in terms of supporting Lebanese reform ambition. So the political signal, I think, is clear. The other effort that I think is one in which we are very well placed right now is our support to civil society actors. So, Haneen has mentioned this. I think it's particularly important. The way in which we have worked with the World Bank and the UN in the context of the Reform, Recovery and Reconstruction Framework gives civil society a very prominent role in policymaking, and not just as implementing partners, in a way that we have not seen before. I think the 3RF is a particularly significant development because it allows civil society to play its normal role in countries where they are based as a watchdog of reform priorities, also as a means to bring expertise at the disposal of the government and talk about what the prioritization should look like in terms of where the money goes. For me, this is really significant. It's about the NGOs. It's equally about the private sector. So that is important. We will continue to support the role of civil society in Lebanon. And if anything, you will see that this will intensify in coming years. Now, the third issue that I would want to mention here is the fact that we actually do have a sanctions regime in place for Lebanon. So this is in place since July. I guess, Joost, you want me to say a word about this. You know that this is currently there is the legal decision has been taken, the political decision has been taken, but there are no names included in the annex of those who you would need to list if you were going to put in place restrictive measures. Now, the reason why we went for a sanctions regime vis-à-vis Lebanon was precisely to say that we did not want to see further blockages in terms of forming the government. We do not want to see that the elections scheduled for next year would be postponed or not happen at all. And we would not want to see these essential structural reforms blocked sine die. So the sanctions regime is not there because we want to take action. It's there because we want to encourage a change in behavior. Now, already what we saw was that, of course, there was a lot of interest and, if you like, political noise around the adoption of the sanctions regime. But what we saw was that the government was formed. I would like to think that there is a direct link there, that there is leverage for the European Union. We are serious about this tough love that I mentioned in my first intervention. And therefore, it is important that it's understood that these things that we want to see happen, well, we want to encourage them. So that is one thing. Of course, we do want to see the elections scheduled next year take place. I have to say as well that we do want to see that there would be the investigation into the responsibility for the port blast, that would come to some sort of meaningful conclusion. And then there is responsibility that is taken. And this brings me back again to this issue that I will repeat, which is confidence. We have to be confident that, that the government wants to undertake reforms and that the judiciary can act in an independent manner, because without that, there is a political issue about responsibility for the port blast, which caused so much destruction, but there is equally a lack of confidence from investors in being sure that they can put their money in, that they will be treated equitably before the law, that they will have access to justice, and that they will be able to get their investments out in case they decide that that is what they want to do. And for now, all these rather complicated issues are overlapping, and there is still obviously very important work still to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for adding layers of complexity, and I certainly will add some more. But I also think that you just actually addressed the third question that has come in, which I'll read very quickly, but it's from Claire Gaudin, who asks, what action, if any, the EU could take to support the Lebanese authorities in order to increase the chances of the expected reforms materializing and to create favorable conditions for the planned aid to be implemented? So I think you've addressed some, if not all of that. Claire, if you want to specify anything more, please don't hesitate to write again. But I'd like to move to the regional front, and a question then for Heiko. Mostly, Muriel Asseborg asked about the role of the Arab Gulf states. They have put also some pressure on Lebanon. And do you see that this is working to support reform, or the opposite? And a related question, because it involves external actors, but is going from the inside out in this case. Hilde Deman, asks about the wider regional implications if the situation deteriorates much further, which it very well might, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So concerning the pressure from the Gulf, particular. So I mean, I don't have the impression that the Gulf is very interested in the whole reform file. That reform is really high on the agenda. The pressure that Muriel quotes is, of course, is related to the presence of, or the influence of Hizbollah on the Lebanese government, and what many claim is Hezbollah's control over the Lebanese state and the Lebanese government. Now, this is, I mean, there are different shades of that pressure. There's the main driver is clearly Saudi Arabia. And it was Saudi Arabia that responded to statements that the Lebanese minister made concerning the war in Yemen with a very harsh reaction, and other Gulf states have followed different measures, but it's clearly Saudi sets the tone here, and the Saudi foreign minister has clarified in the subsequent interview that this was maybe like the last straw that broke the camel's back or whatever, but it's not about that minister. It's really about Hezbollah and Hezbollah's supposed control over the Lebanese state, political system, and of course this ties in with the whole regional Iranian-Saudi confrontation, or attempts to find a way out of this confrontation, attempts by the Saudis to find a way out of the quagmire they are in Yemen, and getting the Iranians to be cooperative, maybe. There are claims that right now the military situation in Yemen doesn't look good for the Saudis. There are claims that Hezbollah is very closely involved in the military efforts of the other side. So these are really like things that have nothing to do with the reform question, the reform file. But of course, they put additional pressure on the system, and it means that the Lebanese government is currently paralyzed on two accounts. On one account is the conflict over the investigation into the port blast, where a part of the government, the ministers that have been appointed by or loyal to Hezbollah and Amal in particular, want this judge to be changed because they think he's biased and is going to turn this into a case against them. So that's the one conflict that the government is paralyzed about. And now it's paralyzed about the question, so should this minister resign? Should he not resign? Is this Saudi imposition on Lebanon that is unacceptable, as Hezbollah says and insists on? So you have it really paralyzed on two accounts, and it really raises the greater question. As long as the Lebanese system is so penetrated by regional players, and tumbles into crisis, or can tumbles from one crisis into another that is also related to the regional tensions, can you actually find a way to do very politically difficult reforms when the system is already so much under pressure and so much dysfunctional on that end?
Thanks, Heiko. I want to come back to you now. We are, as an international crisis group, of course, we look at crises, and Lebanon is very much a socio-economic crisis. And there is the potential of conflict. You've just now hinted at it. And so we are also a conflict prevention organization. We've already seen violent incidents on October 14th and previously. What do you see as the link or the chain between the socioeconomic crisis and potential violence and further conflict? What is that link? So that's one question. The other one is related to the Lebanon is a very weak state. It was a weak state long before this crisis, but it was a weak state that was able to survive in part because in the regional equation, the two or the main protagonists on either side needed Lebanon to remain relatively stable. It was in their respective interests. Do you think that has changed now? Or is there, because if there's going to be a solution coming from internal reform, external assistance or whatever, if that equation has been upset, that balance has been upset, then nothing will work. And then, in fact, the chances of a return to, heaven forbid, a civil war increase.
Well, so the link between social tensions or the deterioration of the social situation and violence, I think is linked to the erosion of state capacity. So you will have, which policeman is going to put his life on the line if he earns $50 a month or 60, right? How long can you send the army to police protests? Protests have turned into riots, and social protests have turned into riots on several occasions. And the army has basically been sent most of the time to control this. How long can you do this? As the misery, the social misery affects army personnel, just as it affects everybody. Like just yesterday, a Dutch journalist sent me a question. They said he interviewed soldiers, and he came up with quotes, and he said, "Do you think I can publish this, or will these guys end up in the military court?" And I read through it, and it's like, these are soldiers and they're actually saying, "You can use my name. I'm saying this loud and clear, and they're like saying, I'm just waiting for somebody to give me to come with me, and become violent against this political elite, statements that you think, wow, this is really this is tough stuff. And they're not going to do it as long as there's no organized structure for such kind of rebellion, if you want. But you can imagine, if that's how these people feel, how much longer are they going to defend this state that gives them absolutely nothing and just puts them at the front line? So now, if you have that situation, and also we have the figures for crime, like murders, car thefts, robberies, what have you, burglaries, have gone up steeply. So police and security forces are no longer capable to provide security. You will have security provided in other ways, right? And in many areas that would mean political parties will be involved in it. Hezbollah, of course, is known to have probably the most comprehensive potential capacity there. In other areas, there will be other political parties doing this. You will have municipalities having their own police forces, which just perhaps the ideal situation is that you have the municipality, you have wealthy municipalities which do exist that who then hire policemen, right, who moonlight, do a second shift, or a private security provider, and then at least you have actual police doing that. But this will be so that the line between formal and informal security provision and actors who carry weapons and wield security control will get blurred, you know, and then you can imagine that you will have violence popping up in areas where control is contested, where party influence overlaps, where sometimes maybe the taxes, the additional money that you need to pay for these people, you know, where there will be conflict, who extracts money where. I mean, and you have other areas like perhaps Tripoli is an example for that, where the local political scene is so fragmented, and it might be rackets. It might be rackets that do this, and who are rackets that blur into criminal rackets, and we then start to fight with each other. So these are scenarios of violence, and they can very easily also become entangled with this larger political conflict. So I mean, we've seen that in mid-October. You know, there were clashes between supporters of Hizbollah and Amal and maybe people supporting the Lebanese forces, not entirely clear. But in the aftermath, you have, I mean, the discussion and the tension that builds up through that means that I think now in these areas, probably people who live in these areas that were, like in this case, Christian and Shiite areas overlap or intersect or border on one another, these people will accept it that there will be armed people in the neighborhood to protect them against the other side. So you have a lot of scenarios that fall way short of what we consider a civil war, you know, the classical civil war, like heavily armed militias having exclusive control over areas or fighting over that exclusive control. That's not going to happen. Not today, not in close. Not in the near future, but also we should remember the Lebanese civil war started in 1975, but the build-up for that war took 5, 6, 7 years, and it started where, you know, in a situation where one side, back then the Palestinians, were very militarily very dominant. Nobody would really challenge them, just like nobody would wants to challenge Hezbollah now can, you know. But 5, 6, 7 years, you had another force that then challenged, you know. And so I would not say in the long run, if the situation does not improve, I would not rule this out.
I'll come back to you. Thanks, Heiko, to the regional equation in a bit. Claire Godin has added to her earlier question. Maybe I'll read it up, and I want to then hand over back to Haneen and Michael to address this to the extent that they want to and can, but also to give a sort of a closing statement as we are approaching the end of our session. But Claire asks, I understand that political messages and trust are key to this dynamic. My question could possibly be widened to know if, for example, complementary actions to support the evaluation and steering of public policies could be envisaged to give every chance to the expected achievement of certain milestones and to enlighten the EU on the maturation of the conditions required for programming. I'm not asking you to address this, but if you can, please do. But Haneen, let me go back to you first, and again to end this.
Maybe I leave that to Michael to address more specifically on EU programming, but I think I just want to say that it requires a lot of heavy lifting. Working in Lebanon as development agents, we spend a lot of time doing the kind of things that we normally wouldn't do in other countries, neighboring countries like Jordan, even Iraq, which is very complex as well, in terms of getting programs and policies through with the government, so that this cost of doing business here is very heavy, but when it works, it pays off. And I think, unfortunately, there's no other way in Lebanon. We have to be pushing tough love, as Michael was saying, providing incentives, coming at it from this way, talking to the different stakeholders. And I mean, really, and this is, by the way, a lesson that we've learned at the World Bank. We're not very good at always talking to civil society and so on. And simply because our programs tend to go through government. But we've learned very clearly since the October Revolution that in Lebanon, it's almost impossible, impossible to do things without reaching out to civil society, but also, being really in connection with the different stakeholders, political, non-political, and just keep the course steady. A year ago, we published another Lebanon economic report. We called it deliberate depression, i.e. this was a man-made depression that was happening in Lebanon. And actually, I want to stress on man, because almost 99% of policymakers in the last 30 years in this country have been of one gender. But the point being that this is a crisis that was, yes, almost deliberate in the making. Maybe the outcomes weren't entirely known by the actors initially, but that how it also means that to get out of it, there can also be a deliberate effort by, and I'm not of the view, there are those that say the current political class cannot get the country out of its crisis. It has to be a total change for something else totally different to come. Well, first of all, it's, Lebanon as a democracy, change will be slow. You don't have one dictator head, for example, to say, okay, we get rid of him and we start over. No, there are many, many heads which you have to deal with. So it's not an obvious thing that so change will come slow. I think the parliamentary elections, which are absolutely key to happen, and the international community must always be pushing the fact that they happen transparently, whether it's March or May is kind of irrelevant, but they must happen. That would be the beginning of change, I believe, because there are so many Lebanese, including those in the diaspora, who are committed to starting to bring some change. So change will start, we hope, with the elections, and we have to find our role as a national community, have to, to support that change, to make those change makers, build institutions, and help people. This is really this kind of two-pronged approach that I think as a international community, we're pretty much united on this view, and hopefully it will really produce some stability for this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Hani. If we still have time, I'll come back to you with a follow-up. But Michael, you saw the question that Claire Godin submitted, and of course you may have other things to say. This is your chance.
Thank you as well. First, let me start by saying that on the question of security, that the European Union is very active here. So we are working to support the LAF model regiment south of the Litani, and we have a very significant investment in community policing. And now, specifically in mind here, of course, at the back of all this work is to maintain stability. It is to ensure that the population has confidence in the security services and the way they behave, and ultimately it is to give the state once again a monopoly on the use of violence, which is particularly important, of course, in a country as divided as Lebanon. Now, on Claire's question about what the EU can do, I think we have any number of possibilities if we can just get our foot in the door and we find the right interlocutor with whom we can engage. So political will is everything. But if I were to enumerate what we can do, of course, since we have the government formation, we've come back into the ministries with technical assistance, trying to impart expertise and know-how, support the ministers in their job of turning around their different ministries. So this is happening now. We are present on the ground again. We just need to have the room for manoeuvre, and we need to know that the ministers involved are moving and pushing reforms in the right direction. I want to come back to the 3RF because I think the 3RF is an engagement that we've seen between the donor community and the government, And the significance here is that we see the prioritization of reforms. So for me, it's an important thing to underline in this panel today. Equally, I think support for civil society, which I've mentioned already, well, we need to continue with that, because those are alternative voices that do not always get heard by the Lebanese ministries. And if I were to add a final point, I think, you know, there are lots of things that we do in different parts of the world. Here in Lebanon, we've offered to conduct a peer review, for example, of the independence of the judiciary. These are things that work elsewhere. So it's not a bureaucracy or political entity like the European Union coming in and wagging its finger. It's about ensuring that peers talk to peers when it comes to reform of particularly sensitive sectors that go to the heart of national identity and of the sense that Lebanon is in control of its own destiny. So for us, all the options are there. It's about political will. Now, Joost, you've given me an opportunity to wrap up from the European Union side. So let me just say, I mean, what our intention is in a nutshell in the coming months. Basically, it's to continue to engage with the government of Lebanon. And it's going to be an engagement that is mixed with strong and demanding focus on the delivery of reforms, to which the government itself has signed up and where we think that the priority should be put. So that's the top line message. We are going to deliver support, in particular support that will help ordinary Lebanese cope with the fallout of the economic and political crises. So we will deliver in the field of education, as we have done for many years. We have an enormous amount of money, well over 150 million euros in social safety nets. So we will continue to work there, because we need to ensure that the most vulnerable do not fall through the gaps, that there is a perspective for them of recovery from the current crises in the medium term. So we will deliver support to encourage these reforms. We've got a clear political commitment that I want to stress here to restore trust and confidence in the government of Lebanon. What we want to see is that the government of Lebanon will be in a position to deliver services to its population, services that any citizen in any country in the world has the right to expect, basic services of education, healthcare, water, basic economic livelihoods, and jobs, and its security. So that's what we want to continue to do. All of this, this is the short term, but of course, what this means for us as the European Union is that we leave the door open and we pave the way for the midterm structural reforms. I think we all on the panel, we all agree that they are particularly complex because of the political, economic situation that prevails in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Heiko, we only have a couple of minutes left, I'm afraid, for you, but I want to, let's forget about the regional equation for now. We recently put out a report that you researched and with a consultant working with you called Lebanon's Compounding Crisis. And in it, you laid out some recommendations also that you think could be done, and that is not limited to World Bank or European Union, but more broadly speaking. Can you give us a quick overview of those? What is a sensible way forward that is actually doable in the current crisis?
Well, I think the first thing we have to realize is that this crisis is not going to go away within a short period of time with some political fixes like a quick IMF program, and in half a year we're out of the woods. So we think we have to think about 1 or 2 years minimum, where external actors have to make sure that the social situation does not deteriorate further, and make sure that the security situation does not deteriorate any further. And there are quite a few things that are being done already, and I think that some of it can be expanded. I think we need to think about the security sector also in terms of salaries. We cannot continue giving them equipment if we can't pay the people who use, or the state can't pay the people who use that equipment. And many approaches or many organizations have shifted to approaches that where they try to identify parts of the infrastructure that work, like part of the state bureaucracies that work and that are efficient, and work with them directly, and also to identify key infrastructure elements. And one very important aspect is keeping the school system going. I mean, like if now we have these 2 years, I mean, the security sector deteriorates. I mean, that's bad, and it can have consequences that I've mentioned. But maybe it can be repaired. But if kids are not schooled for 2 or 3 years, that damage may be irretrievable on top of the losses of Corona. So I mean, find ways either around the Ministry of Education or with the Ministry of Education. I mean, that's really requires thinking out of the box and looking how the situation is on the ground, who you can work with, and be flexible about that. And I think this is happening. I think many donors are doing this. Many governments have come to that conclusion already. We should think about the private sector, what things that can be done to prevent it that companies that have a sound business model go bankrupt simply because they don't have access to credit at this point in time, right? Because they can't get credit to maybe shift their production, orient them toward European export markets, for instance, after the Gulf export markets are now closed, also for political reasons to a large extent. So I think a lot of different tools have to be used, and we need a larger concept of what is humanitarian support that includes, as we say it in the report, keeping the pillars of the state standing. Really.
Thanks, Heiko. We do have to end, I'm afraid. I wanted to ask questions more about the role of civil society and the regional situation, but we won't be able to do it in this session. The world faces many serious crises, and we heard Hanin Syed say that this particular economic crisis is unique in the depth and severity and in the short period in which it came about. And so it presents new challenges that will be very hard for everyone to counter. And but it is heartening to hear at the same time that our institutions are committed to working toward this. It may be very frustrating, certainly for people in Lebanon who don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. But it's not for lack of trying. But I think in the end, real change will have to come from within Lebanese society. We have to leave it at this. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and the next session will start at 3:30 Central European time. So I bid you adieu, but not before thanking Michael Miller and Hanin Syed, and of course our own Heiko Wimmen, from the depth of my heart for your presentations and your presence here today. So thank you, and well, have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of the 2021 Crisis Group Watchlist Policy Dialogue. On this fourth session, we will discuss what comes after Venezuela's recent regional and local elections. Obviously, as background, we have to say that Venezuela continues in a profound, not only political crisis, but also socioeconomic and even humanitarian deteriorating situation. At the same time, this year there was a process to seek a negotiated solution with the help of the Kingdom of Norway, but that process is right now at a standstill point. It has been suspended. And then we had these elections just this past Sunday, where a majority of the opposition decided to go back to a participation strategy. And perhaps from an international standpoint, the most important development was that the European Union sent an electoral observation mission to assess the electoral conditions on the ground. It has already issued a preliminary declaration, and it will issue a full report in the coming months. So obviously, all this situation begs the question: what's next? What's next for the country? Especially considering that in the years 2022 and 2023, in principle, there are no electoral events scheduled by the Constitution, but in the year 2024, there should be a new presidential election. So to discuss this, we have convened a very distinguished panel composed of Phil Gunson, our senior analyst for Venezuela. Phil has been in Venezuela since the conflict started, when Hugo Chavez rose to power. Also, Marianne Jimenez, who is an academic. She is from the School for Global and Area Studies of the University of Oxford. And then Mr. Javier Niño Perez, the Deputy Manager Director for the Americas of the European External Action Service. Before we delve into the conversation, I would like to give the floor to Ivan Briscoe, the Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the International Crisis Group. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mariano. Welcome to all our viewers and participants, and of course to panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a few brief words before we begin. You may well be aware that Crisis Group has been working on Venezuela for a number of years, well over a decade now. It's one of our main areas of activity in Latin America for very simple reasons. The intensity of the political conflict there, which reached perhaps its highest peak from 2019 to 2020, and of course the scale of the humanitarian crisis manifests most clearly in the 6 million or so Venezuelans who have fled the country. This year appears to have marked some degree of change in the situation, in the scale of the conflict around Venezuela. Yet we're still unclear as to how great that is and how significant these changes might be. And I'm looking forward to the opinions of our panelists on that subject. As Mariano has mentioned, we've seen a series of electoral reforms and the deployment of the EU electoral mission. We've seen a certain moderation of the discourse, certainly in the United States, very clearly opposed to the Maduro government, of course, but also within Caracas. We've seen the start and then the suspension of talks between government and opposition in Mexico. And of course, we've seen most recently the visit of the ICC prosecutor to the country to open a formal investigation, seemingly with consent of the Maduro government. At the same time, there's a humanitarian crisis of great dimensions. 95% of Venezuelans are now estimated to be living in poverty. The dividing lines on the opposition are significant, and this will be, I think, an issue for reflection from Phil and Marianne and others. And these dividing lines, the fracturing of the opposition to the Maduro government, are based to a degree on differing assessments of what is politically and ethically desirable in the context of a repressive authoritarian regime, which has now been in power for well over 20 years. But beyond those issues of political tactics, strategy, of cohesion or disunity in the opposition, there is a deeper question, which I think remains unsolved, and will be one which will be interesting to hear the opinions of our participants here. Are we looking at a series of processes which will lead to free and fair presidential elections in 2024, which is, of course, the greatest desire of the opposition, potential chance to take power? Or are we seeing a series of steps to legitimate an authoritarian government which will not leave power? And on that note, I gratefully hand over to Mariano, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for those introduction words. So perhaps we can start the conversation with Phil. Phil, in your view, what's the most important implication of the regional and local elections, first for the government, then for the opposition? And, in general terms, what do you think was the implied message that the people from Venezuela who participated and those who abstained sent last Sunday?
Thanks, Mariano. I think it's a lot easier, perhaps, to discuss the implications for the government and the opposition than it is, in the first instance, to speculate about exactly what the message was that the electorate was sending. And I say that because, of course, it's one thing to analyze election results in the context of a democracy, and it's another to analyze election results when you have an autocracy that's in power that limits, at least in terms of the way the campaign goes, the way people are the people, the parties and the individuals that people are allowed to vote for. That has all obviously skewed things in ways that make it a lot harder to interpret. But I think the first thing that comes out of it, to my mind, the most dramatic thing or the most interesting thing is, first of all, the relative collapse of the government vote. We've seen a very, very significant fall in the number of people voting for pro-government candidates. Some of those who are on the line may recall that Hugo Chavez, when he was alive, aspired to 10 million votes, and it never got beyond about 8.2 million, but now we're down to a little over 3 million. And admittedly, this is a regional and local vote, so it's not as if they were voting for president, but I still think that's significant. Beyond that, however, there's the real significance of the erosion of the vote in the rural heartland of Chavismo. And we've seen in this election, although the opposition didn't get a lot of gobernaciones, of state governorships, the Chavistas lost the state of Cojedes. They are, the state of Barinas, the home state of Hugo Chavez, is on a knife edge, even as we speak. I mean, there's a serious fight developing, if you like, in the state of Barinas over who will be adjudicated. It looks as if there was a narrow victory for the opposition there, which would be truly dramatic if confirmed, but there seems to be resistance on the part of the government. Now, of course, this set of elections was very much an experiment from the point of view of the government and the opposition. The government, in the sense that there was a certain opening, obviously partly intended to restore some kind of normality and perhaps achieve a little more international recognition, with a view to seeing how far that could go without risking national power, which of course is not at stake on this occasion. For the opposition, it was an experiment in the sense that the mainstream opposition, the so-called unitary platform, now standing on the ticket of the MUD, the Democratic Unity, the old Democratic Unity coalition, which no longer exists, ironically. This was the first time in several years that they'd actually put up candidates for election. And I think that those who backed that idea, that change of strategy, will be cautiously optimistic about the way it went. But I think there's a big caveat here, because having seen the government having seen what's happened, I think it's impossible to imagine that the government would simply proceed along this course until we have in 2024 a relatively free and fair presidential election and subsequently parliamentary election. I think when national power is up for grabs, the government will not operate on the same basis. And so the question is, and I don't want to anticipate the coming questions in the discussion, but I think the big issue here is how can the government be persuaded that 2024 is not a life or death issue, if you like, not simply a zero-sum game where the loser will be, cast out into outer darkness and potentially subject to persecution by the winners. If that's the case, the government's not going to go for that. So I think that would be my first assessment of what happened on Sunday.
Thank you so much, Phil, for those initial comments. And precisely your last bit allows me to pose my first question to Marianne. Obviously, coming out of these elections, Marianne, the issue of opposition coordination, it's going to be front and center, not only part of the discussion, but also of the main challenges the opposition will face, in the road to 2024, and even perhaps before, because some sectors within the opposition are already starting to discuss the possibility of activating the recall referendum against Maduro early next year. So my first question to you is, what ways do you foresee as possible roads for the opposition to achieve that coordination? And I want to basically tie that with what Phil was saying, in the sense that it is very likely, or perhaps I should ask, do you think that it is likely that in the road to 2024, the government again will have a lot of incentives to scale even upwards the repression, and therefore making not only more difficult, but also less likely the coordination within the opposition?
Thank you so much, Marianne, and everyone for the kind invitation. I think it's crucial, even though it's hard sometimes to analyze the opposition, given the really harsh context that they're operating in. It's really crucial because the key question is how can Venezuela transition to democracy? So it's important to pay attention precisely to the strategies that opposition movements, parties, but also civil society groups, and also how the support of the international community can be channeled so that Venezuela can eventually democratize. So you asked me about a crucial question, which is coordination, but I think that there is a step prior to a collective effort of coordination, if that makes sense. I think that after these electoral results, the opposition is really in a key moment to use the next years to come, particularly 2022, to design a collective strategy, which needs to start from within. From within of each of these parties, they need to decide which path they're going to go. But for them to be on a collective path, they need to first figure out individually what they want. So I think that and I say this because I think that the internal work is key. Even though I agree with Phil that it's hard to get a sense of what voters are thinking at the moment, the abstention was also a clear message. So that means that people are unhappy with the way it's going. Not only Chavistas, which are discontent and didn't get mobilized sufficiently according to the government's estimate, but also on the opposition side. So that means that opposition parties need to renew their leadership. They need to work on their basis. They need to work on a different message. And that has inevitably also to do with the internal mechanisms, right? So we know from existing research that strengthening programmatic and value-driven leadership is key. We also know that increasing organizational capacity within each party from other cases as well is key. And we also know that creating networks with activists and non-partisan groups on the ground can be key, particularly in non-democratic context. So that means that parties need to try and strengthen, despite the context, their internal structures, and that is also linked to the leadership renewal that many parties are talking about in Venezuela at the moment. Then the second part, I think, before I come to the crucial point of coordination, is the democracy promotion through the newly elected offices, and that means that those offices, those spaces, can serve as as an arena for organization, for mobilization, for reconnecting, establishing linkages with grassroots movements and with the population, and show from those spaces, despite the challenges, again, that the opposition can be an alternative to Chavistas. No? Oftentimes, the opposition has fallen into this negative partisanship, or negative identity. That means being primarily anti-Chavista or anti-Maduro. But it's going to be really important, if they want to mobilize in 2024, that they have an own program, something that voters and the electorate within and also outside Venezuela can connect with. So they have to stand for something, which is why the value-driven and programmatic leadership is really important. And then the final point is the coordination mechanism, right? So after doing all this work that cannot be done overnight, obviously, parties and these different alliances that have emerged need to decide on a path forward. I really strongly believe from my own work, but also what we're seeing in other societies, is that the opposition will need coordination mechanisms. It's not enough to have a platform or aim. They really need internal decision-making rules and conflict resolution mechanisms, so that there is a credible commitment within these partners, to pursue one strategy and one goal. And I think that that's going to be more likely amongst groups that share a strategy. What do I mean by this? I mean parties that have decided to, let's say, go the institutional and electoral path, right? So, but part of that coordination agreement needs to also be some sort of a body that can oversee these internal rules and that can implement these.
Marianne, are you there? I think we lost Marianne. Okay, go ahead.
Should I? I'm back. I'm sorry for my connectivity. Yeah. So I was saying that these internal rules are going to be essential, but not just the rules and the strategies. Let's say if a certain group of parties and movements have decided to go down the electoral and institutional path, it's going to be important to have a decentralized and a more collective horizontal mechanism that can oversee the implementation of those rules, if that makes sense. So the big problem with platforms like Frente Amplio or Plataforma Unitaria is that it didn't have those rules, and it didn't have a body that could oversee the implementation of those rules. So looking forward, I think that's going to be really key.
Thank you so much, Marianne. So perhaps now we turn to Javier Niño Perez. Javier, the last time that the European Union set out a specific policy in relation to Venezuela was earlier this year, and I think that that policy very much set out what was going to happen this year. First, with a decision to engage all relevant stakeholders in Venezuela, despite the differences that the EU has, mainly with the government. Also a recognition of, the diversity within the opposition. And then this road of political participation and, being as helpful as the EU can, specifically on the issue of electoral observation. So perhaps my first question to you is, the elections just passed. We have already a preliminary statement from the mission, and obviously now everybody's thinking about so what's next for 2022, 2023, and perhaps the key event in 2024. So do you think that those variables set out in the council's conclusions early this year still apply, or perhaps we are walking towards a change of policy in the EU towards Venezuela?
Many thanks, Mariano. Can you hear me? Well, okay. Many thanks to the crisis group, Ivan, Phil, and Mariano. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and at the risk of sounding excessively spontaneous, and not least because I think this is a file where we fundamentally see eye to eye with International Crisis Group in terms of what the structural problems is and how to go about the way forward. Mariano, the straightforward answer to your question is yes. I think the main principles and the spirit of those council conclusions remain valid and can be summed up quite simplistically, maybe in two ways. One is that we need to apply a policy of principle pragmatism when it comes to Venezuela. This is the name of the game. I mean, and the second element is that commonsensically we should expect this to be a long-term undertaking. And let me try to put these two together. I mean, basically what we said in the council conclusion is that the way to bringing back democracy and stability and prosperity to Venezuela will be a difficult one, would be a long one, and one that would require, as I said, pragmatism and many compromises, difficult for all sides. And hence, as you said, the need to be continuously in a position where we can engage with all stakeholders. I mean, the easy way out when it comes to Venezuela is to criticize the local authorities and point to shortcomings and deficiencies, and that's fine. I think we can all agree on that. The difficult part is how to go over those structural deficiencies, how to get to a situation where we can now fast forward it into 2024, have credible, free, transparent presidential elections. This is the main principle. I think that these elections have shown a number of things. First of all, sadly, that the Maduro is still holding on very tight to whatever power he has in the country, and that is very difficult to anticipate how he is going to release that power. This is clearly one of the main messages of the opposition of the election. Another message, and it came out quite clearly, as you said, Mariano, in our statement, is that whilst acknowledging that de facto situation, there's been a number of positive elements that we cannot deny. The National Electoral Council had for the first time two legitimate members of the opposition. Cooperation on the ground with our electoral observation mission was fairly positive overall. And, whether they are limited, the opposition has gained, whether it was limited, has gained some power. And I think a message, these elections have allowed us, the Venezuelans, to send a double message. One relates to the abstention that was mentioned by previous speakers. So the fact that there's that the Venezuelans are tired of this political situation. This is a strong message that came out of the elections. And the second message is, whether, and this is notwithstanding the fact that the Maduro retained 20 probably of the 23 gobernadores, overall, the non-Chavista vote probably, let's wait for the final result, outnumber the votes for Chavistas. So the country is not politically unified, far from it. There's a diversity and there's hope, that there's different voices can emerge and be heard in the near future. Now, the corollary to your question, Mariano, which is an interesting one, is obviously what is the way forward. We believe that the way forward needs to factor in all these elements. It's difficult to see, and I'm going to be very blunt about it, it's very difficult to see a breakthrough in 2022. What are the incentives for Maduro now that he has consolidated, at least relatively speaking, his power? What are the incentives for Maduro to change radically the situation? That's difficult to see, all the more as the US goes into a period of elections, Florida first in 2023. What can we realistically expect in 2022? The negotiations in Mexico has come to a standstill. Again, it's very difficult to see the breakthrough. So this is the first point. I mean, let's breathe deeply and let's keep our expectations realistic. let's combine this with the fact that in 2022, there will be a number of important electoral processes in the region that might take, for instance, Lula to power in Brazil, that might have that might see a change of power in Colombia. You know, how that is going to play out is still difficult to say, but you know, we need to factor those elements in. So all this make us so led us to the conclusion that our principle pragmatism policy remains valid. We need to deal with Maduro. We need to keep working with the opposition, support those who believe fundamentally in the things we believe: free democracy, freedom of expression, free participation. And lastly, I think, and maybe this not came out as clearly in the council conclusion, but it's also the spirit of many of the things that have been said, call out again to the opposition to bring up, to come together united. I mean, sadly, as you have mentioned, had the opposition been completely united in these elections, the result would have been slightly different, and this is a bit of a shame. So without withholding the need to to keep criticizing the Maduro for his shortcomings, I think. Given the resilience of Maduro, we also need to focus on the opposition and being, as I said, very persistent in sending a message of unity. Mike had made a number of very, very good points, but one inevitably important one is, the one of leadership. Who should be the leader of the Venezuelan opposition? How do we read the results of the elections in terms of the legitimacy of the different leaderships? And this is a very difficult process that the opposition has to go through. But fundamentally, and to not to be too long, Mariano, I think we believe that the spirit of the council conclusion of 2020 remain valid.
Thank you, Javier. Just a quick follow-up before I go to Phil again. Javier, perhaps one of the main challenges that the EU will face, and we have already seen this, is that in the run-up to the election, and now after the election has passed and the electoral observation mission issued that preliminary declaration, is that many factors within the government are basically trying to undermine the validity of the report, of the declaration, the validity of the mission, and obviously, eventually the validity of that final report. Basically, the government, thinks that the EU is biased in favor of the opposition, and then that the EU is trying to impose its democracy model in Venezuela. So perhaps one of the big challenges, or I would say that the EU has two really key challenges moving forward. One is, how to actually work with the government, and it will need the help of other international actors to actually advance in those further electoral guarantees. That's the first challenge. And second, I think that the EU will have the challenge of how to avoid that the government simply closes the door to its engagement to the EU, and the most clear way it could do so is not allowing further electoral observation missions in other elections in Venezuela. So what's the thinking right now on how to deal with that great challenge?
I mean, let me start by saying that, when we went into this process, when we decided to send an electoral observation mission, we knew that we would be criticized by both sides, obviously, inevitably. It was almost a lose-lose situation that we thought we could turn into a win-win. And I think that has been the case, actually, paradoxically. I mean, first of all, let me start by stating something that is important. We went into Venezuela at the request of the Venezuelan government. There was an official request by the Venezuelan government for the EU to go and observe the elections. Now, the Venezuelan government was very well aware of what we do when we send an electoral observation mission. We have sent hundreds of those missions to very difficult countries in the past decades. And they knew that our electoral observation missions have very high standards, and they would look very thoroughly into what was going to happen before, during, and after the elections. So whatever comments the the Maduro has on the electoral subversion measure are legitimate, but they shouldn't come, what the final result of the election shouldn't come as a surprise to him. And we should take things with a bit of a grain of salt and put in things in the political context of Venezuela. This is one important element that we need to keep in mind. The second element that we need to keep in mind is that our assessment of the cooperation with the Maduro regime has been fairly positive in terms of what has happened on the ground. I'm not saying about the conditions that presided over the electoral process, but I mean the cooperation with local authorities were very good, and this has been acknowledged by all the participants in the mission. And this gives us some hope that despite of the criticism, there is an interest in Maduro and his entourage to see how they could progressively make progress in case they are interested in holding credible and free, transparent election in 2024, which still remains to be seen. But I hardly see how they would ask for an electoral observation mission and how would cooperate so effectively with us if they weren't at least slightly interested in assessing the possibility of working together towards in 2024. As I said, I don't want to sound too optimistic, because it's difficult to sound optimistic in Venezuela and knowing how much Maduro wants to hold on to power. But at the same time, as I said, there's something that tells us, that the fact that they requested this mission, the fact that cooperation was effective on the ground, maybe can come in usefully in 2 or 3 years' time, when and if there is the possibility to organize presidential elections, which is obviously the main objective. Now, what is going to happen now? Diosdado Cabello has already said that as far as he is concerned, the electoral observation mission should not return to publish the final report in January. Let's see what the final decision is. For us, it would be completely inconsistent with what has happened so far, because as I said, this was done on demand of the Venezuelan government, who knew very well what the electoral observation mission could, what was his mandate and what the outcome could or could not be. So, I would be disappointed, obviously, if the mission is not allowed to return to Venezuela. But in my view, it wouldn't be consistent, and it would rather be publicly perceived as rather strange vis-a-vis Maduro, given what has happened so far.
Thank you so much, Javier. Phil, perhaps I want to go back to the third part of my first question. And Marianne was saying something that I think it's very important, which is there was a very large abstention on this election. Obviously, there are multiple reasons for that, but still, abstention has, as Marianne was saying, it is sending a key message. There are already some political leaders that are saying that abstention was basically, as a message against those factors that within the opposition that participated. But my specific question to you is, what have you heard on the ground as how did Venezuelans see the election, and how are they reacting to the political conflict? Because there is this feeling that there is a very important part of the population that is basically fed up with the political conflict, doesn't want to know anything about politics, and are basically banking all their hopes in the little and unsustainable economic improvement that has arrived to the country as a consequence of dollarization. Phil.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And it's one of the reasons why I said at the beginning that I think it's actually, we have to be very cautious about interpreting what the electorate exactly is saying here. And there are a number of reasons, I think, for saying this. In terms of the overall abstention, which the CNE put at 59%, I think, nearly 3/5 of the electorate. We have to take into account that they're basing that on an electorate of 21 million, whereas in fact there are only about perhaps 18 million or less, 17 million by some counts, people who are on the electoral roll who are actually available to vote, because people can't vote in regional local elections from outside the country. So that's one thing. The abstention may have been less when you look at it in terms of the reality. Also, and perhaps a more important point is, abstention was very patchy And it seems to me that where you had candidates, or particularly, depending obviously on local circumstances, but where you had candidates who were locally popular with a strong message, where people understood why they were going out to vote, people were absolutely prepared to go out and vote. Abstention, ironically enough, was extremely high in the municipalities of Caracas that are the heartland of middle-class opposition to Chavismo. But go to Zulia and look at the results there. There was quite a lot of enthusiasm in Zulia for turning out to vote, and Manuel Rosales and UNT in Zulia produced extraordinarily good results. So I think that the electorate in Venezuela is absolutely ripe for an opposition with a clear message, with good candidates, that acts together. Because one of the things that people have been saying to me in the last few days consistently is how frustrating that, we want change. And some of these candidates we don't even like very much, the opposition candidates, but we would even vote for them if they pulled together, if they came together, if there was a unified front, and if they gave us a message. And it's extremely frustrating for people to go out and cast their votes for what they consider to be opposition candidates. And of course, there's huge debate about who's opposition and who isn't. But they go out to vote essentially for change, and they find that the same old faces are returned because of the divisions in the opposition. So that's why I would say that you have to be very cautious about the way in which you interpret the phenomenon of ascension, which incidentally is also not that far from, clearly there have been in the past regional local elections where abstention has been much lower, but overall these are not elections that arouse the same degree of enthusiasm as a nationwide presidential or parliamentary election.
Thank you so much, Phil. Actually, one of the key points you alluded to is that demand of unity within the opposition, and that actually allows me to turn back to Marianne and ask her, obviously you have studied in depth how can why the opposition coordinates and why sometimes it doesn't. So my question is, in terms of next steps, in your view, what would be, let's say, the first or the three most important elements that would need to happen for the opposition to start walking towards a more coordinated stance, not only in electoral participation, but also in gaining the credibility within the population that they can really deliver that change, not only towards the democracy, obviously, but also towards economic prosperity. And in that analysis, and I don't want to overcomplicate things, but in that analysis, I think that it is also very important if you could factor in something that is being widely discussed right now in Venezuela, which is that within the diversity of the quote unquote opposition, there are some elements that that are perceived by others in the opposition as co-opted or as working for the government. So that, I think, it's an additional challenge that needs to be accounted for. Marianne?
Thank you, Mariana. Well, obviously, these are very, very important, but also big questions that would really have to carefully think about. I want to, before I go on to the elite question, right? So political elites, political parties, and so on and so forth. I think that it's really crucial to highlight that Venezuelans want to vote, unlike what some might believe. I think that, and this is what Phil was also conveying, is that where situation on the ground was really bad and there was an alternative that kept working, like for example in Zulia, and did not quit and did the work during several years, people went out and voted. And that's actually something really key, because it means that the work on sort of reinstitutionalizing the electoral route is important, and it can work, right? So you have a basis to work with. So even though there was some abstention, I think that it's crucial to highlight that Venezuelans still have this, let's say, need to participate and willing to go to the polls. Obviously, they need an alternative to vote for. So you asked me precisely about the elites. I think that this is about choices and about incentives. So the question is, how can incentives be shifted so that in these individual groups that now exist in Venezuela can work together? Again, I don't think that everyone can't coordinate to participate in elections with parties that don't want to participate in elections, if that makes sense, right? So everyone, or those who have a strategic vision about, let's say, regime collapse or intervention or any of these sorts, are not going to have incentives, I don't think, to be part of an electoral coalition, a broader coalition that can seek to liberalize let's say, negotiate liberalizing reforms until there's the big change that many hope for. So deciding who can, on the opposition map, who can be part of such a coalition is a first step. And then I think it's about choices as well, like I said. And those choices are, they also need to be created by society itself, and also, I think, helped by the international community. And that means that, for example, other leaders are also taken into account. So for the opposition to have a decentralized, more horizontal coordination platform, it's important that everyone, let's not say everyone has the equal weight, obviously, because parties bargain with the votes that they have, with the support that they have, with the limited resources that they have. But it's going to be important to have a broader, more plural alliance. Obviously, you asked me about these these groups that seem to be co-opted. I'm not talking here about a coordination among groups that, in a way, either support or are silent in the face of persecution and repression of other opposition parties. I think that that's not really what we're talking about. So in these several coalitions that exist, I suppose that in those, for example, Alianza Democrática, where many say there are factors that are not co-opted, I think that it's important for them to distance themselves as well and try and seek coordination and cooperation with others in the more, let's say, traditional opposition. And traditional opposition parties would also, I suppose, it's an internal negotiation. They would also have to think about whether they want to accept a broader coordination agreement. And even though I agree with Javier that 2022 is not a year of big change, I think that it's a crucial year precisely to build those linkages, to reestablish trust, to have those internal negotiations that won't happen overnight, one, and two, several years have passed, and those groups have not really talked to each other, but more distance from each other. So what we need to do is, I think, see a more organized civil society that can lower the costs of them working together, pressure political elites, and I think that there is also where international actors can create conditions to shift incentives for divisions, if that makes sense. And obviously that's a really difficult task in a context of an autocracy. So more work needs to focus on, I think, and with this I end, is on how to create the spaces for these groups to let's say, first to meet and to engage in these internal negotiations to create this platform. Voters don't see that the opposition is getting, quote unquote, their act together, but they will be willing to vote if they see the opposition, managing these internal conflicts.
Thank you, Marianne. So before I move forward, I just want to remind the audience that there's the possibility of posing your questions in the Q&A chat box. So please do so. We are tracking them, and I will start making those questions very soon. But in the meantime, and before we go back to Javier, I want to go back to Phil and ask him a very key question, which is, some minutes ago I alluded to this, this situation that is happening, mainly in big cities, Caracas and perhaps Valencia and some others, that there's a part of the population that feels some sort of economic improvement, mainly because the government has allowed a process of dollarization, which allows not only the people that had already savings in dollars to spend them, and a much more wide variety of products, but also people that are working in Venezuela and before didn't have sufficient money. Some of them are now being able to even earn payment for their work in US dollars. So my understanding obviously is that situation is not obviously benefiting the majority of the population, and as we saw in the elections, it appears that the situation in the rural parts of the country is substantially different to that feeling on some cities. And that leads me to the question of the humanitarian emergency. How are you assessing that situation, which obviously is very worrisome? How can it evolve in the coming year? And not only, perhaps I'm not asking you to tie that, but obviously that is very important in the context of the negotiation in Mexico, which we saw supposedly an agreement to try to advance on those issues with the installation of a specific negotiation table for social issues, but that simply didn't crystallize. So how are you seeing that situation, and how do you connect that to the possibilities of negotiating on those areas? Because then I want to go back to Javier and perhaps discuss a bit more about that negotiation and US policy. Phil.
Yeah, it's very frustrating because obviously the political timetable, if you like, and the humanitarian timetable don't coincide. There's an enormous emergency going on in Venezuela, which has not stopped. We've seen some advances. We've seen the World Food Programme come in and start a pilot program feeding school children. That's a very important advance. But there is no real possibility of solving this humanitarian crisis, this humanitarian emergency, without a political settlement. That's the fundamental point to make. I think unless there is a political settlement which allows, for example, the lifting of sanctions, which brings in to government people with a better idea how to run the economy, for example. But in the meantime, a lot of things need to be done. The exodus continues. It's quite extraordinary that we're seeing now something that would have been unthinkable just a few years back, which is, thousands of Venezuelan migrants crossing the US border on foot. I believe the figure for October was something like 13,500 Venezuelans picked up by the Border Patrol trying to cross the US border. That is extraordinary. A lot of these people are not coming direct from Venezuela, but they're coming from countries that have already hosted them, that are in a bad situation because of the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic and the economic crisis associated with that have affected all the countries of the region, and have affected Venezuela in particular, because businesses have closed down, people have lost their jobs. There's been a greater strain, for example, on the health service. And that if you think that in 2019, the World Food Programme, I think their figure was something like 2.2 million people who out of a population then of around 29 million, who were in a situation of extreme food insecurity. And then you add on to that, because this has not been updated since, but that if you add on to that all the impact of the pandemic, it's quite clear that Venezuelans, for the most part, are suffering tremendously. Now, you mentioned the economic changes, and I think that's tremendously important. It's true that these relaxation, for example, on exchange controls, the relaxation of price controls, put more products on the shelves, which many people can't afford, but have spread dollars around in some sectors of the economy. I think we have to look at that as well against the background of the collapse of the oil industry, the fact that the makeup, the structure of the Venezuelan economy is changing. One of the reasons, for example, I think why the government had such difficulty in getting out the vote on Sunday is because they no longer have so many public employees, public sector employees that they can more or less order to go out and vote. It's severely limited the mobilization. But beyond that, this, and it's too big an issue to go into here, but I think it would be very valuable to study the way in which the rapid changes that are taking place in the Venezuelan economy will condition the kind of transition that might be possible in Venezuela. And the way, and one of the reasons, one of the conditionalities, if you like, on that front, is that new actors will emerge to the extent that somehow the control of the cash flow is less in the hands of the government and more in the hands of other independent actors who may or may not be pro-democracy, but certainly might want different things from what the government wants. So I think I signal that as something that needs attention.
Very interesting, Phil. And I think that has a lot of relationship with not only the currently suspended negotiations in Mexico, but also to how the international community is assessing the situation. Javier, some sectors within the opposition have basically accused the EU of playing in favor of the government, given the EU disposition to send an electoral observation mission. And the EU believe that that electoral participation is one of the ways to transit in the process of recovering democracy in Venezuela. And some people argue that that the US government was obviously very skeptical on participating on the regional elections, and obviously when you see the reaction of the US government after the elections, they do put the emphasis on the lack of sufficient electoral conditions to consider the election free and fair, but at the same time they do commend the opposition or the part of the opposition that decided to participate. So I think that this year has been very interesting in terms of, US and EU coordination in relation to Venezuela. We have seen several statements, joint statements, not only signed by the EU and the US government, but also by the Canadian government. So my question is, right now, what do you think are the main points of agreement, and what are the remaining disagreements between how the EU and the US are assessing the situation in Venezuela?
Very good, Mariano, good question. Let me just briefly touch upon your reference to the fact that we've been criticized for sending this electoral observation mission and thus sending a signal of some support in the government. Well, you just have to listen to what Diosdado Cabello said today about our mission, and it's exactly the opposite. And when we send out that mission, the fear in many quarters would be that this could serve to legitimize the elections and consider them free, transparent, and credible. I would challenge anyone, now the report is out, to tell me in which way our electoral observation mission has legitimized an election, and I would just refer them to the report and the main findings that keep pointing to structural challenges and the number of deficiencies. But anyhow, let's put that aside. You ask about the US. Listen, I don't want to go back to the previous administration. I don't think anyone in this room wants to go back to the previous administration. But if we focus on what has happened and what we see now, I think there's much more in common now than there was obviously 1.5 years ago in reference to a number of elements. Number one, I think there's wide consensus on the fact, and I don't want to praise excessively the International Crisis Group, because somebody might believe that I'm getting paid for this, but this is one of the main elements that you keep pointing to in your reports. There's no quick fix for the Venezuela solution. The previous administrations have a different take on this. At one point, they suggested that some something suddenly could happen that could transform Venezuela. Obviously, I don't think the new administration in the US believes that, and they are aware how complex and how long this process is going to be. And this is obviously an element where we come together, because this is something that the US have been long advocating for a very, very long time. This is a central element. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be full of compromises and difficult solutions. And the second element, you know, that and this is part of this is part, for instance, of the policy on sanctions. Mariano, you referred to the fact that we had a joint statement with the Canadians and the Americans on the 25th of June, and that statement for the first time put on the table openly the issue of the sanctions and how sanctions have to be brought into the equation to find a solution for Venezuela. This is the first time that the US administration has publicly spoken about sanctions being part of a negotiation process, and we consider that as something that, again, could help us work together. The second element, I think, where we see also eye to eye, and again, going back to the previous International Crisis Group report, is how we have to engage with the Americans, goes without saying, with the Canadians, but we have to talk to everyone, and we have to talk to those less like-minded countries. The Russians, the Chinese, the Cubans, whether we like it or not, they play a role. And the Russians are actually physically part of the negotiation process. And I think, again, this is an element where we all can come up, the Americans and the EU and many others can come together and realize that this is going to be a common undertaking that would include those countries that are more sort of in favor of one view, and those who, you know, don't see eye to eye necessarily with us in terms of the deficiencies and shortcomings, democratic shortcomings of the system. And the third maybe interesting element, and this is something a bit more provocative that we haven't really discussed with the US as well, but I think what we need to find convergence is, again, to how to turn what is happening in Latin America, how to turn that into a process that could help us. Let me explain myself. We don't really know what is going to happen in 2022. We can't really see into the crystal ball, but changes have already happened in Peru, in Bolivia, and changes might happen in other countries like Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. The latter is particularly important, of course, because of the significance of Brazil. Now, let's anticipate or let's foresee a scenario where Lula is elected in 2022, and maybe, and I'm saying maybe, there is also political change in Chile and Colombia that goes into the direction of a more pro-left-wing agenda in Latin America. I think this scenario is at the same time a bit problematic and a bit hopeful. And let me explain myself. It's a bit problematic because let's make no mistake. If Lula is elected in Brazil, if Petro is elected in Colombia, if Boric is elected in Chile, I don't think that Maduro is going to feel any weaker. Probably initially he will feel a bit stronger. And this is clearly. Now, having said this, I think we would have an opportunity precisely to engage with those leaders, Lula, Boric, I'm anticipating something might happen or not might happen, Petro, that might be in a more comfortable position to talk to Maduro and persuade him that change is desirable, that the way forward should include compromises, and that ideally we should all come together to bring forward a process that could bring back democracy and stability to Venezuela. So it's just a glimmer of hope, because as I said, there's two elements. One is uncertainty. We don't know who will be elected in Brazil's, Colombia, and Chile. But if political changes do happen in Brazil, and if, for instance, Lula is elected, let's try, together with the Americans, together with the Canadians, together to many others, to talk to the Brazilians, to talk to other regional actors, and I'm thinking about the Cubans, undisputably, to try to see how we could have the help of those countries to persuade Maduro that, you know, we are willing to work together. We know there's going to be a long process and a complicated one, but that changes need to come in Venezuela sooner than later, not least because, as Phil said, we're not only talking about the political crisis, but we're talking about a very severe, acute humanitarian crisis. And, you know, this is not just about the Venezuelans being able to vote, it's about the Venezuelans being able to eat and be healed and go to school. This is what we're talking about. Our conclusions in 2020 refer explicitly to this point. We need humanitarian access. We need to deal with the economic situation in Venezuela. And at least that part, maybe going back to making points, is something where we could make progress in 2022 without giving extremely hopeful in terms of political change, but maybe that dialogue with civil society, that dialogue with the authorities, that dialogue with the opposition, that dialogue with the whole of the international community could facilitate a more significant and effective involvement when it comes to humanitarian assistance, for instance.
Thank you so much, Javier. I think that perhaps one of the differences, of the remaining differences between the US and the EU is that starting from that council conclusions, EU council conclusions that we saw very early in January this year, the EU, recognizing that the opposition was increasingly divided, said that they were going to start listening and engaging with all actors within the opposition, obviously recognizing the leadership of Juan Guaidó. On the other hand, the US government has continued to insist on the recognition of Juan Guaidó as the leader of the opposition and as interim president of Venezuela. And it seems that policy will continue in the year 2022, even though the extension was initially considered for 1 year. And that leads me to a question I want to make to Marianne, which is very much in line or related to opposition coordination, in the sense that you have a situation where a very important country, the US, is basically supporting one fraction or part of the opposition. The opposition inside the country is deeply divided. And after these elections, we saw some leaders within the opposition, and even after, saying that the solution to this is call for an internal election within the opposition, where the people that support the opposition in Venezuela basically vote for their preferred political leader. So the specific question, Marianne, do you think that method of resolving the divisions within the opposition would lead to greater coordination, or it could basically backfire and end up having the effect of producing more divisions within the opposition?
Mariana, I'm really sorry. The internet was breaking up. I don't know if it has to do with the question, because it's a tough one, but could you very, very briefly repeat whether it had to do with the vote, whether the elections has an impact on how the opposition, who is legitimate and who is not? Is that what you were trying to say? I'm sorry.
So let me rephrase really quick.
Yeah.
The question is, before the election and after the election, some factors within the opposition have been calling for an internal opposition election to decide who has the most popular support and who should be the rightful leader of the opposition. Obviously, leaving aside the difficulties of undertaking that process, my specific question is, do you think that resolving the difference within the opposition through that method of an internal election, do you think that would lead to greater coordination within the opposition, or do you think it has the potential of cementing further divisions?
Thank you. That's a great question. I would first say nobody likes to be displaced, right? Nobody wants to be off the picture. So bearing that in mind, I think that I think Venezuela slowly should maybe move away from this idea of having only one leader, because that brings the opposition always into these cycles of high expectations, and whenever that leader fails, very, very low expectations of change and demobilization. So I strongly believe that the way that the opposition should learn to work from now on is in a more decentralized and in more horizontal way. So the more voices, even though that means a smaller size for everyone, I think the better. And particularly because we're talking about a government that is authoritarian. So whenever one is taken out, let's take a look at what happened in Nicaragua. Obviously, a very, very unfortunate, sad situation. There were other leaders available. So what we know from the work on opposition movements, civil society also, and also political parties is that the more leaders, actually, the better. I'm obviously simplifying here, but what I'm trying to say with this is that you have now small hubs of I would say legitimized leaders on the ground. So you have a little over mayorships, a little over 100. You also have at least 3 governorships, and as Phil was saying, there are others that are being disputed. So those can become voices within the broader opposition camp. I think that the selection mechanism for a candidate is more prone prior to the presidential election. I think that, of course, the opposition should go. It had a good experience with the primaries in 2011, but decision-making and strategy formation should not be, I don't think, in one person or sort of attached to one leader and one party alone, if that makes sense. I think that the selection of a candidate makes sense in the face of a presidential election, but it doesn't make sense, to me at least, as a way to resolving who conducts the opposition. I think Venezuela needs to move away from a caudillo style types of politics. I mean, that's what has happened on the government side for over 2 decades. So the opposition, I think, should represent something completely different. So a more horizontal, pluralistic, grassroots-based leadership. And obviously on a top elite level, and that's what I was trying to convey in my first comments, is that the way to renew the leadership is not just by having one new Guaidó or one new Enrique Capriles. It's also by renewing political parties from within. So maybe it's way to start by redemocratizing internal mechanisms through elections, for example. No? And I think that instead of dividing and sort of reducing the number of political leaders, they should multiply them. And I think that now the past elections represent an opportunity there, and not only an opportunity, it's a change of the internal political map, whether some leaders like it or not. That's the new reality. New voices are there and will continue, I suppose, to emerge. And on the other hand, and on a positive note, I believe, if you take a look at some of the new leaders, let's say Primero Justicia or other parties that lost elections and then recognized that loss, they talk about a learning process, right? During this electoral event. And it's a different type of message. It's recognizing that a lot is still missing, but that a lot also can be done. So I think that, and wrapping up on your question, Mariano, I don't think that one big election is going to solve the leadership issue. And I don't think that centralization is the way forward for the opposition. I think quite to the contrary, what's really important is to decentralize and create horizontal mechanisms, which obviously does not mean that the leadership shouldn't renew itself. The way that the opposition can renew itself is one, which already occurred through the elections, but also through internal elections within these parties and the growth of these parties locally, which again, I know it's not an easy task, but it has been happening. It has happened in other societies. And I think if there is a focus and a shift within local actors, within civil society, but also within the international community, I think that pushing and helping the opposition to get to that place, can have a productive result, or can be I think that productive way forward for 2022, 2023 in the face of the presidential elections, which should take place in 2024.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We are running out of time. We only have 5 minutes, but I want to perhaps wrap it up, making a question to Phil. Phil, perhaps, in all this discussion about what comes next, what is what has been a little left behind is the Mexico negotiations. The government suspended its participation after the extradition of Alex Saab to the US. Just the day before the election, Maduro said that conditions are not ripe to go back to the table. How do you foresee that process evolving? What concessions do you think that the government could make in order to revive the likelihood that the process will actually deliver results, not only for the elites, but also for the Venezuelan people? And how do you assess the participation so far of the international actors, stakeholders in that process?
Well, as you say, the process is suspended at the moment. It's not clear whether the government is going to go back. The government has said that it will. It's said that the process is suspended. It's not walking away. It's giving it some time. I think it was always to be anticipated that before we saw what happened with the 21st of November elections, it was unlikely that anything very substantive would be discussed in Mexico. And I think one of the objectives that the government has, I think that the Saab stuff is a bit of a smokescreen. I mean, I think they're using that. I mean, the Saab stuff is important to them, but it's not germane to the issue of the elections themselves. They dragged Saab in as a supposed delegate to the talks, but that was merely in order to be able to make a big fuss when he was extradited. I think the question for the government now is, they want to see a different set of opposition figures facing them across the table. They've always said that it was unrepresentative for just the Plataforma Unitaria to be represented there. They feel that for example, the parties that took part in the parliamentary elections of December should be represented at the table. That's not popular, of course, with the Plataforma Unitaria, because they say that's not real opposition, that those are just government stooges. But more broadly, of course, any election, any process of negotiation is a negotiation, if it's going to work, between two or more parties that actually have something to offer to each other. Does the government feel that it's worth going back to the table because the people on the other side are going to be able to give it what it wants? And the government wants sanctions relief. The government wants international recognition. To the extent that the US, to go back to your reference to the so-called interim government, I mean, to the extent that the US continues to say that it recognizes Juan Guaidó and that Juan Guaidó is the leader of this process, one assumes that the government is thinking, well, we have to at least have that part of the opposition at the table, because otherwise the US is not going to give us the concessions that we want. And the other question is, of course, what does the opposition want out of this? I mean, they say it's very simple, even though in practice and in terms of the details, it's a lot more complicated. The opposition say they want a free and fair electoral process, if possible, bringing forward the presidential elections of 2024, but in a free and fair way. Now, as I said before, I mean, it does seem to me that there's, we have to be realistic, to echo Javier, we have to be realistic in our aspirations. The government is not going to go into a free and fair presidential election in 2024 if it thinks it's going to lose. And by lose everything, lose not only political power, but lose possibly individuals' freedom, their assets. So that's not really on the cards. The question is, if in order to get people back at the table, and not just back at the table, but into a process that actually produces results. I mean, I think one of the things that needs to happen, for example, is that we need to activate not only the social mesa, the social table, it doesn't sound quite right in English, but the mesa de atención social that was agreed in Mexico and has not been set up. Not only that, which would be important if it were to work, although the signs obviously are not good. But beyond that, to implement the call in the Memorandum of Understanding from back in August, that a consultation mechanism be created so that those who are not represented at the table can have their say, can make their demands. And more broadly than that, going beyond even the question of the negotiations, we haven't really touched on this and we have to leave it in suspense really, but it would be wrong, I think, to leave without mentioning the tremendous role that I think civil society, organized civil society, is called on to play at this point, because neither the government nor the opposition as currently constituted represent Venezuelans. I mean, even taken together, they don't even represent half of Venezuelans. There's a vast amount of people out there not represented in Mexico. And the fact that, you know, for the first time really in Venezuela, we have the emergence of significant civil society space that is autonomous and that doesn't depend on one act or the other is tremendously important. I think civil society, just to conclude, civil society at this point in Venezuelan history is called on to make demands of both sides and to make it very clear that they are not political, but that they have an interest in all of this, and that the opposition needs to get its act together. The government needs to make concessions in terms of broadening the democratic space and attending to the humanitarian emergency. And that's something that maybe we'll have to leave for another discussion, but I just wanted to bring it in at the end there.
Thank you so much, Phil. Obviously, unfortunately, our time is up. I want to really thank Marianne for her participation. Obviously, I think, you know, the issue of opposition coordination, perhaps, you know, as I will say it, I think it's going to be one of the key issues of the year 2022. And it is obvious that without that coordination, it is very unlikely that Venezuela will actually walk towards democracy. So thank you so much, Marianne, for all your insights. Javier, thank you so much for your candidness, for sharing the EU position. And Phil, obviously, thank you so much for your report on the ground. It is quite important to have that perspective and actually, you know, always factor in the needs and the interest of the Venezuelan people in all this tragic situation. So given that our time is up, thank you again to all our panelists. Thank you to the audience. And before we go, I will give the floor to Giuseppe Fama, our head of EU affairs. Giuseppe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariano, and thank you very much to all colleagues who joined this very interesting panel. Dear friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests, this discussion was our last panel, and I have the honor to lead us towards the end of this year watchlist policy dialogue. We had 2 days of rich debates and exchanges on some key crisis and conflict situations where we believe that the European Union and its member states can play a positive role and help prevent emerging conflicts, manage the impact of existing crises, and mitigate their fallout on the most vulnerable ones. Most importantly, we place greater emphasis on what the EU and its member states can actually do to help solve these issues. And let's quickly look at all of them. In Afghanistan, our first panel, additional 5 million persons are at risk since the Taliban takeover. We discussed the absolute importance of addressing the basic needs of all Afghans and devise ways to deliver more than immediate humanitarian relief. The collapse of the country's basic services, which was already largely dependent on donor assistance, will require more substantial engagement. And although dilemmas on how to engage with the Taliban government remain, we were happy to hear from the Special Envoy Nicholson that the EU is very much looking into that while defining how to maintain its principled approach. In our second panel on the Horn of Africa, we looked at the concrete risks that Ethiopia might turn into an all-out civil war due to the conflict in Tigray. Our colleagues agreed that the main way to avoid that scenario is a stronger and more coordinated diplomatic pressure on all sides. Whereas in Sudan, the new power-sharing agreement that reinstated Prime Minister Hamdok does not heal the fragility of the country's democratic transition. The economic leverage here would be key to nudge parties, but there might be risks for the population. And we're pleased to hear that the EU is carefully looking at the humanitarian situation and the provision of basic support as they try to keep the transition on track. It was also important to hear about the renewed engagement of European actors also in Somalia, which will face critical elections among other challenges, primarily the role of Al-Shabaab. On today's first session on Lebanon, our guests discussed what seems the country's worst crisis since the civil war, where the political stalemate, harsh economic recession, and humanitarian plight are pushing the state on the brink of total collapse. Although the EU remains committed to continue supporting the country, there are significant constraints to enable foreign assistance to have a lasting impact, especially as the establishment is not implementing much needed reforms. A violent outburst last month showed that the potential for a security crisis can add more fuel to the fire. In this regard, colleagues noted that the question of the payment of salaries in the security sector might be critical going forward. But most of all, in order to prevent even more long-term damage, basic services and education shall be preserved at all costs. And then I will not repeat what we just heard during our excellent fourth session on Venezuela. I will just recall the lively exchange on the need to pull pretty much any lever the EU can handle, from diplomacy to technical assistance through humanitarian aid to help reach a negotiated solution to the crisis. All these issues were very much at the heart of the 4 sessions of this year's policy dialogue. But we also observed some general questions that is worth highlighting to better understand what is the trajectory of the role of the European Union in global conflict prevention efforts. The number one, the EU is actually a relatively young actor in the field. The European External Action Service and the European Commission and its Service for Foreign Policy Instruments were established only 10 years ago. Anticipating the signs of conflicts and shaping a way forward to build peace is a challenge for even more established actors committed to the same goal. And yet, the EU can live to higher expectations. There is a lot it can do with its political, diplomatic, and economic power, and all the crisis management instruments at its disposal. All of the panels indirectly touched upon this point. And yet, Europe's internal discourse and other external challenges at times put the whole conflict agenda to the side. It will be essential to maintain conflict prevention as a key priority of the EU foreign policy. Else it will come at the cost of its own ambitions as a global player, and most importantly, it might leave many more at risk of violence and hardship. Number 2, one positive development is that internally, the European Union has become more aware, forward-looking, and sensitive to early warning and conflict analysis. A helpful innovation in this direction came this year with the new EU Global Development and Cooperation Instrument mentioned in the opening session, which is now known as Global Europe, or NDICI, for those who followed this debate from the outset. This instrument requires the EU to perform thorough conflict analysis at the launch of the process to deliver financial assistance to fragile countries, which is a very helpful step. But of course, this should not be just a spot exercise, and the cases that we discussed, like Afghanistan and Sudan, are quite illustrative in this regard. So this shall remain a very much ongoing process. Number 3, EU institutions and governments need a complex infrastructure to do all of that. Oftentimes, this implies the existence of specific chunks of large bureaucracies, like it is in ministries of foreign affairs, to deal specifically with conflict issues. While this is in general a welcome development, it should not happen in isolation with the work of those parts of the same institutions that follow and entertain regular diplomatic relations with third countries. And more, the EU and government actors should avoid geographical silos more generally. As we discussed, for instance, in the Horn of Africa panel, it is not possible to understand perspectives about the region without considering the role of the Arab Gulf states, just to name some. So there are low-hanging fruits to reap from blending the work of conflict prevention structures with other parts of those institutions. And I'm very happy that the participation of EU officials to this watchlist policy dialogue actually reflected a good diversity of actors within the system engaged into the conflict agenda. And final point, while it is true that EU efforts to develop early warning and the exchange of conflict analysis are crucial to make it more effective, this is not something that the EU nor its member states can do alone on their own. This is especially the case of those contexts where governments have a different kind of access than that other conflict actors enjoy, and including organizations like CRISIS. It would be key to make sure that the EU remains open to the exchange with other partners, and we're glad that this very conference was actually an opportunity for that. This exchange can help the EU and all other conflict actors to tell the signal from the noise intervene at the right time to address critical conflict drivers, and lead to more timely and coherent responses, programs, and interventions overall. And this actually leads us to the end. We had a very lively exchange with a rich and diverse participation. My colleagues tell me that we had over 220 persons who registered and joined our calls, while additional 100 listeners followed us via our YouTube channel, where you will also find the full recording of this event. But this is not the end, and there is more to come in our plans already. Crisis Group will always continue looking at the EU's role to help prevent, mitigate, and solving deadly conflict. And indeed, we are already in the process of producing our new EU watch list for the year 2022, which we will present next January. And of course, there is much more coming through the work of our regional programs. And we encourage you to follow our main channels to learn much more about them. Before closing, let me also renew our thanks to the European Commission and the External Action Service who support this work, particularly via the instrument contributing to stability and peace. And let me thank very much all listeners, EU officials, diplomats, journalists, friends in the NGO community, and colleagues in crisis groups who joined and made this event possible. Let me particularly acknowledge my colleague Lavinia Pretosu, who deserves much of the credit for organizing this conference. And above all, thanks to all of you who keep following our work at the International Crisis Group and work in the same direction to take global conflict prevention efforts one step forward every time. Bye-bye, everyone.